before I start out, however, I have some things to say about Colorado history, but the stories I tell are primarily to fifth graders, and they are, all kinds of folk tales and that sort of thing, and historical stories. But I'm also going to talk about some of those historical things that are outside of Colorado. But primarily I'll try to stick to historical Colorado. And I'll tell you just a little bit about how historical I am here. In 1959, after my first year in college, some of my friends said, from Ohio, said, we're going out to this place in Colorado to work for the summer. Would you like to go along? And I said, sure. So I ended up in Estes Park pumping gas at the Texaco gas station in the summer of 1959. And every week or so would pump gas into a Cadillac that belonged to Gene Autry's wife. So that's kind of historical. But, and then we eventually moved to Longmont in January of 1971. And historically, what's been interesting for us as a family is traveling around to various places in Colorado, and that generates the interest in, let's find out about what happened here or there a long time ago. Just recently, I guess it's more than a couple of months ago, we went over to around Montrose and Ouray and Ridgeway and explored some historical kinds of things over there. So I'm going to start off talking about some of the historical Colorado stories that I have put together or have gotten from books and told. And as you can see, I'm not a PowerPoint person. The first one is Buckskin Joe and Silver Heels. And a lot of particularly at Twin Peaks Charter Academy, they have standards that they like the kids to think about: being caring and trustworthy and responsible. And so the teachers there have asked that in the stories, can you include some of those kinds of things that the kids can relate to in relation to the standards we ask them to think about. Buckskin Joe is a little mining town over kind of between Fairplay and Breckenridge. The real name of the town was Lorette, but Buckskin Joe, everybody called it that because the original miner there was Joe Higginbottom, and he always wore buckskin outfits, so everybody called it Buckskin Joe. And in one of the saloons or dance hall places, there was a young woman who wore silver slippers, and when she danced with the miners, the glow from those lamps that they had hanging from the ceilings, everyone called her Silver Heels. And she turned out to be a person who, when they had a great outbreak of a terrible disease, she went around to the different cabins and helped people. And so the miners collected $5,000. This is like in 1869. And they went to give it to her, but they couldn't find her. And so they gave the money back to the miners. But people saw this woman come to the cemetery because her boyfriend was buried there, and she wore a veil. And they thought, oh, okay, her face and body was all pockmarked from that terrible disease. She didn't want anybody to see her. So they knew she had a caring heart, and they wanted to do something. So what did they do? They named a mountain after her, Mount Silverheels, 13,260 some feet in between. It overlooks Fairplay, and it is in the moonlight. The snow on that kind of sparkles like her silver heels. And so that's, you know, she was a very caring person and took care of those who were ill. One of the other stories I put together is about Enos Mills, and I'm sure all of you know something about him. His family lived in Kansas originally, out in the country. And he had this stuff that was really bad, and they thought maybe going to Colorado would help him out. As it turned out, I think it was he was allergic to wheat. And you don't want to be in Kansas if you're Anyway, so he walked 65 miles from his house to Kansas City and got on a train and came to Denver and ended up living with a sister in Greeley for a while. But then he went up to this place between Allen's Park and Estes Park. And there was a cousin there that owned a place that was eventually called the Longs Peak Inn. And Enos Mills and his cousin turned out to be guides taking people up Longs Peak. He took, let's see, it was 45 or 50 different trips taking or going by himself up Longs Peak. And 300 times he climbed Longs Peak taking people up there. And he turned out to be one of the people who really put Rocky Mountain National Park together. In 1905, the Stanley Hotel was built, and people started coming all into Estes Park, and he thought something's got to be done. We've got to protect this area from all of these people coming in here. And so he wrote articles to the paper and the magazines and did all these kind of things. And he ended up being called kind of the father of Rocky Mountain National Park. And as you know, there's still a little cabin up there where he lived and that he built a long, long time ago. And there's a small museum in there that his granddaughter for a while ran. One of the other Colorado stories that I put together was about Uncle Dick Wooten. And he was a guy who came out from Virginia, and he hunted buffalo and for Bent's Fort. And they would pack up the buffalo hides and send them back east for people to make hats and all kinds of stuff out of. But he did all kinds of things for like a year and a half. He and 10 or 12 other guys went up into the mountains and trapped beaver. And they brought beaver pelts down to Bent's Fort, where it was sent back. He ended up buying a farm in Pueblo and took some buffalo calves and started raising buffalo. But eventually, Dick Wooten opened up the very first toll road in Colorado over Raton Pass. And if people came in and didn't want to pay, why, Uncle Dick Wooten would pull out his little revolver and say, I think you'll pay. Now, of course, the cavalry and the Native Americans could go back and forth across free. Well, eventually, one of the railroads, the Santa Fe Railroad, came to Uncle Dick Wooten and said, we'll give you $50,000 for the right-of-way over Raton Pass. And Uncle Dick Wooten said, no, I won't sell it to you for that, but I will sell it to you if you will let my wife ride the railroad free for the rest of her life and provide groceries for her. And they did. And she lived till 1904. And every week they would provide groceries for his wife and the family. And she could ride the railroad whenever she wanted to. And so care of family was one of the things about Uncle Dick Wooten. Chief Niwot. He was born, somewhere along a river or a creek like the St. Vrain, where there were all these trees where the Native Americans would camp. And every day he'd reach out to his mother and want something to eat. And so they named him Niwot, left hand. But he grew up around this area, and as all of the settlers started coming out and the fighting that was going on between all of them and the things that were terrible, Niwot decided that, look, we have to figure out something other than killing each other. He even took his family back through Nebraska and Iowa to learn how to farm. And he was really good friends with a man who had a farm, which is around that area where Niwot is now. And he wanted peace. However, they forced his tribe down to Sand Creek. And when Colonel Shivington and his group went in there and killed all of those people at the Sand Creek Massacre, Niwot, there are people who said he was standing in the middle saying, we want peace. We don't want to fight, when they killed him at Sand Creek. And so that's one of the things that I talk about for Chief Niwot, that he wanted was peace. The stories and things that I've gathered, there are some books back there that talk about the jerks from Colorado, the women who had ranches and those kind of things in Colorado. And so you're welcome to look at those. That's where I've gotten a lot of the stories, and some of the stories, historical stories, I printed out copies there if you'd like to look at those. The famous Turkey War of 1859. It was Christmas, and this rancher brought in a bunch of turkeys, and this was two little towns, Denver on one side of the creek and Auraria on the other side of the creek. and he pulled his wagon full of turkeys up there near some of the gambling halls and that kind of thing, and was out in front of his horses, you know, telling people, hey, I got turkeys here if you want them for Christmas, because they were hard to come by. 4 guys came up and stole all the turkeys out of the back of his wagon. And there was a huge uproar. And the bad guys in Denver were going up and down the street shooting their guns and things. And as it ended up, they identified who 4 of them were and said, okay, you got 5 hours to get out of town or we're going to hang you. And they left. But that whole story really is about a time when they were determining whether Denver was going to be run by the bad guys or the good guys. And as it turned out, hopefully, the good guys are now running Denver. Ben's Fort. For several years, I wanted to go visit the rebuilt Bent's Fort, and we were able to do that. And it is a fascinating story about, you know, at one point in time, that was the largest building west of the Mississippi River. And they traded with the Native Americans. And the river that went by Bent's Fort, on this side, on the north side, was the United States. On the south side was Mexico. And as it turned out, you know, there was a war between the United States and Mexico that then took over the rest of that country south of Bent's Fort. But the Bent brothers ran that, and St. Vrain actually worked at Bent's Fort before he came up and started Fort St. Vrain out by Platteville. And Uncle Dick Wooten, as I mentioned, worked at Bent's Fort. And it's a fascinating place to see and find out about how, I mean, women were even giving birth there at Bent's Fort. So it was kind of a cosmopolitan sort of place at one point in time. It eventually burned down. And they're not sure whether the Native Americans burnt it down or whether one of the Bent brothers burned it down on purpose, because the federal government also had come to him wanting to buy it. But those are Colorado interesting historical kinds of things that happen. And as I mentioned, I do other kind of historical stories. As it started out, one of the teachers at Twin Peaks Charter Academy said, we're studying the Renaissance. Can you tell stories about the Renaissance? Louis Braille, the young man who invented developed the Braille language. When he was a young kid, his father made saddles and leather kind of goods, and Louis Braille poked himself in the eye with an awl and ended up getting all infected and went blind when he was a young kid. And it was even after that, when he was 18 years old or so, that he developed the Braille language, which we still use today. So overcoming a handicap is something that I try to put into some of those historical stories. Little Orphan Dog. There's a story that I found that involves the United States Postal Service, where this dog wanders into Albany, New York, post office and is adopted. And the dog ends up going around the world on railroads and ships and became the that's Oni. Oni. And there was a forever stamp put together with Oni on it. But it's a fascinating story. Even one time, he was on a train that went into Canada and he didn't have a Canadian dog license, so they seized him. And the people in New York had to raise $2.50 to get a license so he could come back into the United States. But those are some of the kind of historical stories that are fine. Under the Eagle is about a Navajo code talker. And there is a book written about him called Under the Eagle. And it's a fascinating story. He is today 93 years old. And up until a couple of years ago, he was going around to universities and giving talks about his life. He was on the Battle of Iwo Jima for the whole time the battle went on. And so it's a Native American story about someone who served this country. Mary McLeod Bethune. The teachers usually ask for some stories during Black History Month. This lady was born after the Civil War, but was interested in educating young black children. And she ended up down in Florida and started a college called Bethune College, which was then merged into Cookman-Bethune University, which operates today and has 4,000 students in Florida. Undark and the Radium Girls. Another teacher said, "Oh, we're studying chemistry. Can you tell a story about chemistry?" Well, back during the First World War, they hired women in the United States to make watches that glowed in the dark for the military. As it turned out, the paint they used, called Undark, was made out of radium. And a lot of these women developed problems with the bones in their jaws and that kind of thing. And so this brought about workplace standards and those kind of things. The day the war stopped. This is historical kind of things happen as you travel around. And we were fortunate enough to be in St. Francisville, Louisiana, where during the Civil War, a Union commander on a boat on the Mississippi River died. And he was a member of the Freemasons. And so they went ashore, and it turned out there was a Confederate officer there who was the head of the Freemason Society in St. Francisville. And so they brought this man ashore and buried him in St. Francisville with a funeral procession and a combination of the Confederate and Union soldiers buried him there. And yes, it's connected to Longmont in a certain way because there's a building just north of the corner of 3rd and Main Street that the Freemasons built in 1906 that still stands there. And for a long time, I'm not sure whether they still meet there or not, but I think they did when we first moved a long time. So that was a story of the day the war stopped. How much time do I have?
I'd say keep going.
10
Keep
minutes?
going. Now,
Okay.
Paul's going to tell a story, but how long's your story?
Mine's just fill in if you need it.
Okay, all right. Keep going, John.
I have a story to tell you to close out. And some of you may know about this Doc Susie. Susan Anderson was born in 1870 in Indiana. As a young girl, her mother and father separated, and interestingly enough, she and her brother stayed with the father. They ended up moving to Wichita, Kansas, and she graduated from Wichita High School when she was 21 years old. It would have been 1891, and it probably wasn't unusual for people being older, taking them longer to get through school back then. Not long after that, her father moved the family to Cripple Creek, Colorado, and he wasn't a miner, but he invested in mines, and he was kind of a tough father. He told both Susan and her brother, look, you need to do something to make something of yourselves during your life. So she ended up going to the University of Michigan. And she was there for 6 years and ended up graduating as a doctor. A doctor out of the University of Michigan. One of the things not so good, however, was in her time there, whether when she was an intern or something, she developed consumption. And then when she graduated, she moved back to Cripple Creek and was a doctor there for 3 years. Now, that was a mining town back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Interestingly enough, I read someplace there were 33,000 people in Cripple Creek, 55 doctors, and 10 dentists. Which is amazing. Whoa. But she was a doctor there and did fairly well and met a man who we only know as W.R. For some reason, they never got his name. And so they were going to get married, and it was like within a week they were going to get married. He said, I'm leaving, and he left her at the altar. She was devastated. Part of the reason people think was her father had something to do with that. He didn't like the guy and either said something to him or threatened him. Anyway, that really devastated her. So in 1900, she moved to Denver and was going to set up a practice there. However, by this time, I'm sorry about this, but women doctors weren't looked at as good as men doctors. So she didn't do too well there in Denver. So she moved to Greeley and went to work for a hospital in Greeley and worked there for 6 years as a nurse. Not a doctor, a nurse. Now, she had visited some places in the mountains in Colorado, and her tuberculosis wasn't getting any better. So she decided that she would go to Fraser, Colorado. Got on a train, which went over Rollins Pass, and that's the only way in the wintertime you could get to Fraser, because Berthoud Pass was a dirt road, and it was closed from October until May every year. So went over to Fraser, Colorado, and she didn't actually go to there as a doctor. She went there to try and cure her tuberculosis. She ended up, and let's see, this is the house she lived in for 3 years, and it was right next to the railroad track that went through Fraser. I would guess it was maybe 300 square feet, and it was a shack right next to the railroad track, and she was there for 3 years. But she went there to cure her tuberculosis. She did exercises every day. She watched her diet, whole milk. She drank a lot of whole milk and rested, and did not tell anyone she was a doctor. However, word kind of got around, and people found out about her being a doctor. And so her tuberculosis was cured. She was in that place for 3 years, and then the railroad came to her and said, you're on our right of way, we're going to put a road there, you got to move. Well, by this time, she was starting to treat people, and I was a little bit surprised by this, but around Fraser and Tabernash, primarily it was lumber mills, because they were cutting all the trees up there, bringing them to lumber mills, and then transporting the wood to Denver to build houses. And a lot of these lumberjacks were Swedish or Danish. And of course, in those days when they're cutting down trees, it wasn't near as safe as it is now. And so a lot of those lumberjacks, something would fall on them. As an example, Elif Nielsen, somebody came to her one day and said, oh, you've got to come and help him. A tree fell on his arm. And when she got there,